My name is Hillary Brill, and I lead Georgetown's Institute for Technology Law and Policy. We are a think tank at Georgetown University Law School that provides deep expertise to students from around the world, future leaders in tech law and policy that get provided this expertise from academic experts like those who you are going to hear from today from Georgetown University and who you heard from yesterday, and our international experts that are speaking today as well. The Institute is pleased and honored to co-host with Hong Kong University today's panel and yesterday's panel on data sovereignty along the digital Silk Road. Please join future conversations that the Institute provides on issues that you're going to hear about throughout this conference: digital trade, AI and ethics, and other issues of tech law, policy, and public interest. And you can find out more by going to georgetowntech.org. Yesterday, we started off the conference with engaging and compelling panels. And today we can look forward to furthering our discussion of international governance issues. I want to introduce Haoshen Sun, Associate Professor of Law at the University of Hong Kong Faculty of Law, who was instrumental in putting together this conference with many others. So thank you for all of your help to those who put together this conference, those who you're hearing from and those who are behind the scenes. Haoshen previously served as Director of the Law and Tech Center and the LLM program in Technology and Intellectual Property Law at the Faculty of Law. Haoshen is a scholar in many things, including intellectual property, technology law, and Chinese law. And his recent scholarship has focused on the theoretical and policy foundations of intellectual property, Chinese intellectual property law, and tech law, and the public interest. Haoshen has twice won the HKU Faculty of Law Research Output Prize, and he is currently completing a book on a new ethical theory of technology and the public interest. And the book will be coming out in 2021. He also co-edited The Luxury Economy and Intellectual Property with our very own, Georgetown's very own Madhavi Sunder. And he has been asked to speak and teach at a variety of universities throughout the world, including the University of California Davis School of Law and the University of North Carolina School of Law as a visiting professor. He has delivered public lectures in North America, Europe, and Asia, and he's organized many conferences like this one on IP, technology law, and other issues. Haoshen has been called upon by many media outlets and other speaking venues for his expertise on these issues. We are very fortunate to have Haoshen Sun kick us off today, and we're happy to have you here to lead our first panel.
Thank you. Thank you, Hillary, for such wonderful introduction. Good morning from Hong Kong. Oh, I'm sorry, it's morning time in DC. Good evening from Hong Kong. I was feeling that as if I were in DC now, since this is a joint event with Georgetown. So it's such a delight to work with Georgetown on this very important conference. And as many of you know, yesterday's program went very well. And we were talking about, we were actually lamenting that we were not able to meet in Hong Kong, but this virtual conference actually has made it possible for us to meet online and stop the pandemic from, preventing us from, meeting directly. So this is really positive. And, I wish to say a little bit more about the timing of this conference and, how, important this conference is from, a different perspective. Because after seeing the violence at Capitol Hill, I realized that this conference actually has another advantage. It has the advantage of preventing rioters from storming into our conference room, so that we will be able to have a peace of mind to enjoy our program. And it seems that any curfew caused by the riders will not stop our conference from moving on. So, and as you have seen, the conference has actually start a very peaceful day featuring Professor Mark Wu's keynote speech. So I'm very delighted to present Professor Mark Wu to give today's keynote speech. Let me briefly introduce Professor Wu. Professor Wu is Henry Stimson Professor at Harvard Law School. He's also Vice Dean for the graduate program and the International Legal Studies program at Harvard Law School. He is a world-renowned expert on international trade law and working on a variety of issues such as global governance, digital technologies, trade remedies, environmental protection, and foreign investment. He is very famous for his article, China Inc., published at Harvard International Law Journal. And this article has profoundly informed the discourse on China and the international trade regime. So let me invite Professor Wu to give today's keynote speech. Mark, are you ready?
Yes, thank you very much, Haosen, and good morning from the United States. Good day to all of you who are joining us from around the world. I want to first start by thanking Professor Sun and Professor Chandra for organizing what was a fascinating discussion yesterday, and for all of the discussants yesterday for such stimulating remarks. I also want to extend my thanks to Dean Fu and to Dean Trainer for hosting this conference and for allowing this much needed dialogue about critical issues around the future of digital governance. And especially, I want to say, personally, it's a great pleasure to be with all of you on this platform, but nothing substitutes for the in-person, face-to-face interactions in the discussions that we would have. And so I'm especially hopeful that at some point we'll be able to reconvene in that sense. But it's a bit saddened that I'm not able to be with all of you in Hong Kong, but especially to those of you who are up late in Hong Kong, and for those of you who are law students and very much committed to the rule of law and thinking about how we govern the digital space. I just want to add a few small words in my very accented Cantonese to say, so with that, let me share my screen and let me touch on the issues from today's presentation. So the question on which I want to focus today is the lingering question of trust in global data governance. And you'll notice from my slide here that what I want to suggest is that trust takes on many forms, and that trust is to some extent broken at present. And it's that broken trust that is perhaps giving rise to calls for data sovereignty. But as we saw from yesterday's discussion, even that term data sovereignty is a very loaded term that has different implications for different stakeholders. And there are different ways that we can even consider as sovereignty, whether that is territorial sovereignty, functional sovereignty, or some other format, which was a focus of many of the illuminating discussions yesterday. And also loaded on top of that notion of sovereignty are notions of culture, notions of societal governance, and notions of geopolitics. So I think yesterday's conversation was certainly very much thought-provoking, but it highlighted in many ways the different levels in which trust has been broken, right? This is not only trust among nations, it's also trust between individuals and firms, it's also trust between different levels of players among firms, whether we're talking about the platforms versus content creators, and is also trust in terms of the regulators themselves. So I'm going to focus on this question, but the key theme that I want to highlight is to say many of these are old questions. They're questions that persisted forever along the Silk Road, but there is something different about the digital domain that gives rise to making this question about how do we build trust in order to allow for these transactions to happen. There is something a little bit different about the digital domain that this time we have to learn. How do we crack and how do we solve? So if I start here with an area that we know well, and I think what many of you are expecting me to speak on, right? It's this issue of global governance and international trade. And this notion of trust certainly does affect the geopolitical domain. And when we saw this notion of trust really introduced into the global governance parlance at the G20 meetings in Osaka in 2019. And so when Japan chaired the G20 this year, Japan made innovation a very core part of its chairmanship of the G20 and what it wanted to focus on. And in particular, it had arguably one of the largest focuses on digital and data issues of any G20 chairmanship. And this term was introduced, a somewhat awkward term, right? Data free flow with trust. DFFT, right? But the notion here that I want to underscore is that trust is an important part that's embedded in this. In other words, oftentimes we talk about data flows, we talk about data free flow, right? But what this term introduced is to say this is meaningless without trust. And so we can see at the highest level when it comes to global governance, right? Trust is an issue that's very much here as well. Now, if we look at this from exactly the opposite angle, if we look at it from you, right, you, the person listening to this speech right now online, and we think about when you join any app or any platform online, right, you're also considering these questions of trust. And you're also considering these questions of data, and you're considering these questions of data flow. But the trust issue that you're considering is arguably a different form of trust, right, than what was being decided or discussed amongst participants and policymakers at the G20, right? So what I want to just draw our attention to is that these trust levels are embedded at the highest levels when we're talking about global governance, and they're also embedded at the lowest levels when you yourself choose to join anything that's online, right? And so then if we consider this, what I want to next bring along is to say this is nothing new. These questions of trust have always existed along the Silk Road. And so if we take ourselves back a couple of different centuries, and we think about the transactions that have existed along this area that we now refer to as the digital Silk Road, right? These questions of trust have always come into play when one merchant has a transaction with another merchant several thousand kilometers away. And they need to transact through a medium, which at the time may have been gold, but because of the Chinese innovation of paper money, it eventually evolved into other forms of currency. And it involved trust that each merchant along the way was going to deliver. And we came up with innovations for how we would deal with that, including seals, right? Including insurance, including intermediaries, right? And there were means of recourse that were provided for when that trust was breached. So this is nothing new, right? We've been able to successfully facilitate transactions across a range of different governments with different schemes of governmental organization in order in a diverse area, both ethnically as well as politically. And there's this question to ask, why can't we do this again, right? What's so difficult this time around? This has also been done with new technologies, right? So if we think about the rise of the steamship, if we think about air travel and so forth. Every time we've been able to come up with some form of multilateral or global compact that's been able to deal with these transactions and to help facilitate governance along with the rise of this new technology. So those who tend to approach it from this lens says, yes, the problems are difficult, but you need to get out of your 21st century is the most important time to be living in type of mindset, and to realize these questions have always been difficult at each stage with a rise of new technologies, and we are able to find some ways to solve it. And I think there is something correct about this optimistic view, but there is something that is quite different, which is to think about in the past, right, when you passed along something. So I'm going to use an example of a check, right? And I know for some of you, you use your digital wallets, and even a check is an ancient technology that your parents or your grandparents resorted to. But if we think about transactions as they occurred, right, for decades recently, it would have taken some form of a check. And the check was a one-off transaction, because a check, you pass that along and entitled the holder of the check to cash in for this on a one-time basis, right? They could only use that once, right? And it was a tangible item, right, that could not necessarily be replicated. What I want to suggest now, if we go back, right, and you think about other forms of what that would have been, right? The last generation would have been a check, right? Even if you think on a digital basis, right? If you think about when you did wire transfers, right? It was the same thing, right? You were allowing them a one-time basis, right? In which to gain something of value to you in exchange for something else. And if you think back to other mediums of currency prior, right, to either a wire transfer or a check, and you go back to, right, whatever, silver, gold, and so on and so forth. And with that, it was always some form of a paper that allowed for a one-time transaction. What I want to suggest is different about data, right, is data is, again, another currency of value, but data is not necessarily, right, data is intangible, but so could one argue wire transfers and so forth are, but data is not limited to being used once. Data also can be replicated. So it's, in essence, the difficulty that we're dealing with is if you handed someone a wire transfer or you handed someone a check, but this was something that you said, go ahead, you can Xerox this, or you can photocopy this as many times as you would like, and you can cash into this as many times as you would like, but I trust that you will do as I've suggested the arrangement that we have between us. And so you can see here, just in this simple analogy, right, that with data, although the data may be much more mundane, who cares if you could see on the screen that I just searched up the lyrics to Justin Bieber's song, right? Who cares if you know where I am at this given moment? You could tell from my background and so forth where that is. This doesn't matter, right? But what I am handing you is this is something possibly potentially of value that can be replicated multiple times along the way. And that means that I have to have a bigger trust in you. And that gives rise to what I want to focus on are three difficult questions, these three lingering questions of trust that I want to suggest really pose a hurdle to our ability to engage in any form of effective digital governance on a global or multinational arrangement. So the first question is, yes, I place that trust in you when I provide you with my data, but that trust is sometimes broken, right? We know of instances where, right, someone has done more with that, either explicitly, right, or perhaps they've gone beyond the letter of what your understanding of that contract that you quickly scroll down, but you just checked because that's, you just wanted to get on with using the app when that's been violated. So this first question that I want to suggest is, when that trust between an individual who has provided the data and the entity that holds the data, when that has been broken, right, who do you have recourse to? Now, I'm focused on the individual here, but this is also something which happens between firms, right? So when one firm provides data to another firm and that trust is to the arrangement that they have has been broken, right? This is something that happens with you and non-firms, right? So when you're providing to, say, your health provider, right? When you're providing it to your school and that's been broken, when it's something between an entity and its government, right? And that's been broken, to whom do you have recourse? Okay. Now, since we're at a law conference, some of you are looking at this and said, well, you know, I can't believe this guy teaches at Harvard. He just spent a minute asking a question. We all know what the answer to this is, right? We turn to the courts. Okay. And so this may seem as though, right, this is an obvious question, and this is one on which we have near consensus, even across the different societies to which we turn. But the question that's difficult here with regards to this is, who has oversight over the adjudicators, right? Now, it's possible these are formal courts. It's possible these are informal arbitration bodies. It's possible these are, right, self-governing bodies, right? But the question is, to whom are the adjudicators accountable? Because we also know, right, from the history of the Silk Road, that there have been adjudicators, right, who are capable of being bought off, who are corrupt, right, who are in the hands of corrupt corporate entities or corrupt governmental entities, right? In fact, I think there is and for those of you who are not familiar with this, right, I just want to recommend, right, that you watch any of the historical Chinese dramas, right, by which Judge Bao and others, right, have become, right, very famous entities, to know that this is a story that exists, right? And I think this is also true if you look at other parts of history from the western end of the Silk Road, right? So the question here is not so much the answer to who do you turn, right? But to whom should these adjudicators be held accountable? And this is something with which we are grappling very much these days, right? In terms of who has oversight over the adjudicators, particularly not just when they're judges, but particularly when they're say lawyers serving as arbitrators, or when it's a self-governing board like the Facebook board or something along those lines, right? Who should have oversight with that? And it's a question that firms, arbitration bodies, and even political bodies are grappling with today. The second trust question that I want to draw our attention to is, what about market failures, right? Because as was discussed yesterday, right, certainly in the global capitalist system that we have, right, we have faith in the market as the entity by which, okay, well, if you fool me once, right, then I can go and I can post reviews and I can, right, cause some type of movement to cause you to shift away from this. So the market will keep these actors in check. And we've seen, and as long as there is openness for competition and so forth, right, the market should be able to deal with all this. So we had much discussion yesterday about the failure of competition law and how that's created market failures, right? But there are even failures that happen beyond, right, the competition question, right, in terms of how should we be thinking about public welfare? What constitutes public welfare, right? How do we think about spillover effects? Right, and who should have the right to consider spillover effects? And I think what's unfolded around the world the last couple of months with COVID-19 has certainly highlighted this, right? That there are provisions of data that we made, and arrangements that we made, and trust arrangements that we had, but there are unexpected, unforeseen circumstances, right, that does give rise to different questions about public welfare and spillover effects, right? I may have decided with whom I share my location data. But what happens if, right, my arrangement in my location data that I don't want to share that, right, but nevertheless has negative spillover effects for other people's health and other public welfare entities? To whom do we turn to on that? And I think there are a couple of questions, right? We could say we turn to the political arena in terms of legislatures and local and so forth. We can turn for technocratic oversight, right? The technocrats will be able to fix this. We can turn to self-regulation, right? The market players have some arrangement by which they can fix this themselves. We could say we could turn to, right, enlightened sets of nonprofits, other things along those lines, right? But there are mechanisms by which this should be corrected, but there is widespread disagreement as to who we should turn, right? When there are market failures, dealing with either unexpected, unforeseen emergencies, or when the regulations themselves, the regulatory bodies themselves fail to function as effectively as we would like for that to be the case. So to whom do we turn to trust to correct for that? And I want to suggest that that's a second question along the lines of trust by which we don't have widespread agreement. And then the third question is, to whom do we turn to, even if we could agree on that last question, right? To whom do we turn to when that entity fails to perform, right? So what I'm pointing to is we can decide who we have trust, but what happens when that entity in which we have trust fails to perform on its trust? And what happens when then that entity that we have for oversight fails to perform along its lines and so forth, right? And so this is, again, right, this is not a new question. There's nothing new about the digital domain. This is something which existed, right, when we were transacting using donkeys and using horses and so forth along the Silk Road, right? But this has also been a difficult question, right? Because, you know, in the past, right, we've turned to adjudicators, we've turned to political bodies, right? We've turned to informal bodies, arrangements, right? And again, but what happens when it fails to perform its duty? And when you think about this historically, right, we have traditionally turned to this, right? We have traditionally not found an effective way to deal with when that entity fails to perform, right? So if you were transacting along the Silk Road and you said this contract was going to be honored in this manner, right? And then when it moved into the next jurisdiction, it was going to be honored in this manner. And then when it moved to the next jurisdiction, it was going to be honored in this manner. But one of those jurisdictions failed to deliver, right? Or if this was being transacted along the guild, right? And so this actor in this guild then passed it along to this actor, passed it along to this actor, and so forth. But one of them failed to deliver. Even in the historical context, we did not have an effective means by which to act upon that. And so historically, we've said, well, then we raise an army, and then we use force or the threat of force by which to seek performance to deliver. And then we seek to then deal with that mistrust and then to reestablish these types of trust arrangements. This is obviously something that in the 20th century and now in the 21st century is not a feasible means by which to deal with these conflicts, right? And we have seen some 21st century version of this in the rise of the trade war itself, at least dealing with this in a geoeconomic context, right, and so forth. But I think for those of us who engage in international law, our hope is that we don't have to make recourse to these types of arrangements, but that we are able to deal with this through law. But then this asks the question, what forms of law? Is this to be done through a supranational institution? If so, what is the arrangement of sovereignty? Not just data sovereignty, but just sovereignty that takes into place, right? Is this to be done through a self-regulated body, right? How do we trust that type of self-regulation? Should that be done by firms, by non-firm entities, by what mix? How do we decide who serves on that body? And so ICANN is an example where we have been able to deal with this in the internet domain, right? Through, but we've not always been successful. And I think this is the third question with which we are grappling. And so to close then, I just want to suggest these are difficult questions. And these are ones in which not just across nations, we don't have a consensus, but even within nations, we don't have a consensus. Even within a law school, we do not have consensus. And I would argue that possibly amongst the 86 participants right here, we don't have a consensus. But these are the questions in which we need to be focused if we're to find some means of effective data governance, how to grapple with the sovereignty issue as we think about the rise of the data Silk Road. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for such a fabulous and thought-provoking keynote. So let's start the Q&A, and we don't have much time left, but I think we can, for example, have two questions. So first, I have a question for Mark. I do believe that I totally agree with you that trust is a very important issue in global governance, but it seems to me that one of the fundamental issues is about how to shape our understanding about the basic right to personal data. For example, this debate has been going on for quite a number of years. Do we really have any legal right to to personal data such as the geographical locations we have been to, our shopping preferences, etc. If so, are these rights defined as civil liberties or even fundamental constitutional rights? And if we regard highly these rights, and how shall we protect them domestically and internationally, and to what extent can the protection of the right to personal data, increase trust, in the governance of data flow. So I wonder how you think about whether we should spend more time thinking about the nature of the so-called the right to personal data.
So thank you very much for that question, right? I think I'll answer it somewhat succinctly due to the interest of time. I think as lawyers and as law professors and as academics, right, we are always tempted by these theoretical questions. And we can oftentimes grapple with them. And, if we were in a conference room together after the conference is over, we would probably sit and have drinks and we could talk through this with much convenience for hours on end. But what I want to suggest here is from the talk here, right, is that we have to think about what gives rise to trust. So is it legal clarity about the right that gives rise to your trust, right? That because if we think about each right as this bundle of sticks analogy, right? What is it that makes you feel as though, right, this stick to which you are now told that you're entitled, right? Actually, you are entitled to that, and that will be honored, right? In other words, what gives rise to that trust, right? And what I want to argue, or at least what I did argue in my keynote speech, it's not the clarity of the legal definition. Right? It's not, if we are able, rather it's the institutions themselves, and it's the institutional actors, and it's the oversight over those types of institutional actors. And so if we think about another right, right, the right to freedom of self-expression, right, or the right to assembly, right, or any of these types of rights, right, these are enshrined constitutionally in many different types of constitutions around the world. This is something on the term in which we have widespread agreement among, right? You ask a law professor in any different types of jurisdiction, what does the right of free expression mean, right? There is a zone of difference, right? But it's nowhere close to as large as this right of privacy issue, right? But yet you ask the average person in the street, do you have a right to free expression? Right? Do you trust that this is a right that exists, right? And it's not about the clarity in which the courts have spelled that out. It's not about the clarity in which it's spelled out in the Constitution. It's really about the institutions themselves. And so do you have trust in those institutions? And so I think the focus we need to focus on is, yes, definitely we need to take this zone of disagreement and we need to shrink it, right? And we need to come to an understanding of it, but we need to focus even more on the institutions, and we need to focus on how those institutions are governed and who has oversight into those institutions when they fail to perform.
Great. You just mentioned institutions, which I totally agree. And then Anupam actually has a question about institutions. So his question goes in this way. Is the WTO one of the institutions that we should rely on to create this trust? What are its limits in providing an international framework for trust?
So,
or do we need new international institutions to create trust?
Again, I think this is the question that I want to draw everyone's attention to, right? If you think about with the rise of each technology, right, what was the institution that was needed, or what was the institutional innovation that was needed in which to create trust, right? So when we had the invention of the airplane, right, and certainly you need to have, right, effective control over, right, airspace. No one would want to relinquish that sovereignty. But again, you need to have effective transactions across that. What were the types of institutional arrangements that needed to be created? Oftentimes, this has been done, at least from the mid-20th century onwards, through international institutions, right? And much of the focus has been through the UN, through the WTO, in some instances, right, through the OECD. In some instances, they're much more informal, like in finance, right? Like through Basel arrangements, things along those lines. And I think the WTO is a possible institution, but I think we've also seen the limits to what's made the WTO difficult institution by which to resolve this. We've seen this also at other institutions like ITU and so forth, right? We've seen private actors like the World Economic Forum or others try to step into this type of space. But I think that in Asia itself, APEC has played a very important role, right? We've seen even clusters of countries, as will be discussed, Singapore, New Zealand, Chile, and others, right, have tried to create, right, informal ad hoc arrangements by which to make this. And so I think the question is first asking, who do you trust, right? Who do you trust to make these arrangements with? If there are issues of lingering mistrust, and those, I argue, flow back to the way those institutions are governed, then how do we resolve those types of differences, right? We're never going to get to the same page on either this definition or in terms of the institutional oversights. But what we can do is to think about what creates that type of trust, that even if you're different, I trust that you're not going to violate the arrangement that I've made with you. And so I think that's the difficult task ahead. And unfortunately, right, with the lingering geopolitical differences and the high stakes, which is at play here with data, those issues seem to be getting harder, which just provides more impetus for all of us as thought leaders to be even more innovative and even more creative about thinking about how do we resolve what I think are really vital questions about trust that have lingered throughout centuries that our forebears have always found a way to solve along the digital Silk Road, and that I hope our generation will be able to as well.
Great, thank you so much, Mark. We have already ran out of time, but we got like a few more questions in the Q&A box. I'll send them to you. But actually, I think while you were responding to Anupan's question, you actually indirectly responded to one of the questions in the Q&A box. So great job. Thank you so much. And so let's move on to next panel.